Hello and welcome to the Chisme Symposium. This is a one of two-part series focused on the topic of chisme, which some may call gossip, but we will get into the differences of what that may mean. This episode may be used as a standalone or may work with the other episode, which is on the topic of chisme and we don't talk about Bruno. So feel free to watch both of them or use them as standalone episodes. This episode is sponsored by the University of Dayton Department of Religious Studies. It also has a partnership support from the Race and Ethnic Studies program, which houses the Latinx and Latin American Studies program. At this time that we are recording on May 26, 2022. We are mourning the loss of two mass tragedies and so many more across the country. And so with heavy hearts, we hold the victims and their families, both of the shootings in Buffalo and in Uvalde. So I'd like to take some time to welcome our very honored guests, and I'm so happy to be with them and that they said yes to doing this with us today. Our first guest is Dr. Jacqueline M. Hidalgo. Dr. Hidalgo is a professor of Latino Studies and of Religion. She's the chair of Latino Studies program, as well as the Associate Dean for Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Williams College. She is a past president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, ACTUS, as well as the New England, Eastern Canada region of the Society of Biblical Literature. She's the author of Latina o X Studies and Biblical Studies in Brill Research Perspectives and Biblical Interpretation 3.4, as well as Revelation and Aslan, Scriptures, Utopias, and the Chicano Movement from Palgrave Macmillan. With Efrain Agosto, she also co-edited the collection of essays, Latin X, the Bible, and Migration, also from Palgrave Macmillan. She is a student of scriptures as human social phenomenon with particular interest in how certain Latina o X communities make, contest, and refashion their own scriptures, why they do so, and what consequences, especially in terms of social power dynamics, such as relations with other ethnic communities, as well as internal tensions around race, gender, sexuality, and belonging. Welcome, Dr. Hidalgo. Our second guest is Dr. Matilde Moros. Matilde Moros, PhD, is a theological social ethicist working in the field of gender, sexuality, and women's studies, the ethics of resistance and subversion of hegemonic worldviews, and narratives of power lead her teaching and learning toward a counter-narrative method of decolonial transnational feminist ethics. Feminist social ethics must respond to sexual and gender violence and the multiple intersections of which race and its various social constructions have led to the exclusion from the centers of power of many peoples, including Latin American and Latinx communities. Dr. Moros' research on the communal and historical effects of organized resistance to engender and sexual violence has led her to an approach to liberation ethics in which recovery of resistance methods has become the primary focus. Thank you and welcome also Dr. Moros. Both Dr. Hidalgo and Dr. Moros and I have previously recorded a podcast through the HTI Open Plaza series. So you can find a previous podcast on Chisme on this very topic with the three of us. So this is actually a second part episode, and they are also wonderful interlocutors and scholars, as well as great human beings and friends and people who, as we talk about some of these topics, have been the closest among. First of all, we're going to do a little overview on what is Chisme. I've been working on the topic of Chisme since 2008. I presented it at the 2008 Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States colloquium. I never thought that now in 2022, I would still be talking on the topic of Chisme. Much of that has to do because of the support and recommendation and slight nudging, a little bit of pushing and extra articles sent from Dr. Hidalgo very regularly to make sure that I keep reading and working in this topic. Much of it has to do in that paper, eventually published, Dame Chisme, Dame Chocolate, published in the Journal for Hispanic Latino Theology. I argue that the telenovelas Dame Chocolate and Betty La Fea act as conduits primarily through the communication of Chisme for provoking epistemological change in the understanding of human agency as a necessary and unalienable part of human dignity. So what is Chisme? If we look at the historical roots of both chisme and gossip, we find an interesting array. The historical roots for the word chisme are unknown. Speculation has led to two dominant thoughts. It may come from chinche, a broad category for a number of parasitic bugs, including bed bugs. That does not sound very good. The second one is that chisme may arise from schism or cismar, which translates to enter into discordance or divisions. These definitions of chisme seem to carry quite negative connotations, and the history of the word gossip actually comes from a very different place. The 14th to 18th century texts that include the word gossip use it to mean godparent. From the 14th to late 19th century, a gossip could be one of a number of women invited to be present at the birth of a child. Gossip as one, mostly a woman, who engages in idle talk can be found in documents. Gossip can be found used by people like Shakespeare and Milton, and a common definition today is to talk idly about people's other documented affairs. That seems to go back to the 17th century. We can see that using the given dictionary definitions of the words chisme and gossip allow for much more speculation about both words, but gossip lends itself in a historical sense to more positive connotations. Yet, for me, I think that really gossip has so much more to do about. My experience has taught me to call that which Willimon speaks and the definitions given by the Oxford English Dictionary as chisme, not gossip. And while I do not want to deny that chisme may cause division among individuals, I believe chisme has a variety of other effects. The way chisme functions within many of our own communities, as well as a variety of other Latino Schwa communities, may encompass the notion of a sponsor or someone who cares for an individual and spreads news of the individual out of concern. Chisme also provides demarcations for who belongs within the boundaries of certain circles of trust. When one chooses to chismear with one another, one chooses individuals one trusts. People who do not trust one another hardly ever engage in chisme with each other. I'd also like to add the following list to some of the things that have already been said. Engaging in chisme shows human finitude. Chisme often includes how one person has fallen short and what we believe is necessary to live one's best life. Chisme allows ourselves to understand ourselves better. It compels us to be self-reflective. Chisme upsets the daily rhythms of life because it is usually based upon questionable behavior and can be an interpretive tool that forces us to re-examine ourselves within certain normative contexts. Some say we are always discerning what God asks for our lives. Because chisme makes us engage and interpret moral behavior, it can help us with that discernment. Chisme provides a way for us to express in daily life that we are humans filled with contradictions. As has been stated, we share chisme with those we trust and with whom we'd like to build closer relationships. In the book, The Archives of Conjure, Gender Theory, and Religion, Solimar Rotero spectacularly claims, quote, "Chisme is a seductively powerful and quick form of storytelling that works specifically because it plays with the boundaries of secrecy and the impropriety of revelation," end quote. Pietro Semoli, in her article in 2009, states that Chisme, quote, "in everyday conversation can be assigned the following functions: A, economy of information; B, maintenance of relationship between partners; C, definition of the speaker and the hearer's personae at the time of the Chisme exchange; D, rapprochement, estrangement, or readjusting of potions in the scale of values, beliefs, ascriptions, etc. of gossip partners," end quote. She also claims Chisme is an act of storytelling engaged by all people of all genders and has been a topic engaged by psychology, sociology, and computer science. In that same article, she leans on Nicholson, who says Chisme makes a person more positive and that supervisors should include themselves in the Chisme and call it management by wandering about as well. A number of authors have come together to look at Chisme and have included that in the moral realm. So this is Patricia Fasano et al. In an article titled El sentido del chisme en una comunidad de pobres urbanos that was published also in 2009. So clearly this is a topic that has spanned across Latin American theorists for quite a while as well. And they claim that the ethical moral realm of Chisme proposes an ethos rather than a moral system, because an ethos is a moral made hexis, gesture, and posture, is defined by moralities, therefore it opens a plurality, and because it equally values discourse and practice. So the relationship between moral values and practice is dynamic. Values are constantly changing and adapting to actual practices, as happens in life, while simultaneously helping to form those same practices. The practices and gestures which form these ethos are multiple, with the possibility of Chisme being one. Chisme unites various characteristics of ritual with an emphasis on the capacity for Chisme to help in overcoming ambivalence. And then finally, in an article published in 2019, Abhijit Banerjee et al., Abhijit Banerjee et al. State that regarding gossip and sharing important information in communities of about 1,000, quote, individuals who were nominated from their community are indeed more effective at diffusing a simple piece of information than other individuals, even village elders. They further state, quote, when asked for nominations, villagers do not simply name locally centered individuals, but actually name people who are globally centered within the village. So it seems that people who have lots of connections within the village are the people who also share information through the sense of Chisme at a much broader and much cleaner level than others in the community. So now I'm going to turn to Drs. Hidalgo and Moros. Dr. Hidalgo will begin with a presentation on Chisme and scriptures, and then Dr. Moros will talk much more about ethics and Chisme and women and gender studies. So Dr. Hidalgo.
Thank you, Dr. Danda, for that introduction and for the really helpful and expansive overview. I want to talk a little bit from the context of coming out of biblical studies, kind of more narrowly construed, and then thinking about scriptures in a broader way. one of the things I want to say about the field of biblical studies, it has its own fraught history. It seemingly obviously focuses on the Bible, though in another time I might unpack that along a variety of ways. But one of the shifts that has happened in biblical studies in the last 30 years or so has been more of a sort of opening up of methods of interpretation, a sort of breaking away from thinking about there just being one way and one approach one can take to reading the Bible, and instead recognizing that we as human beings come from a variety of different contexts and places and backgrounds. And so we are interacting with the biblical text when we interpret, and that's going to alter what we see in it, the meanings that make themselves sort of, that present themselves to us in different ways. But it's going to alter even how we think about the Bible, the kind of relationship we have with it, the ways that we engage with it. Among Latinos and Latinas who study the Bible, especially, there's been a turn that's been informed by, Latinx theologies, by Latinx studies in a broader way, which is this emphasis on bringing out our own indigenous epistemological traditions, drawing on the sorts of knowledge-making frameworks that are daily life, that are part of the homes that we live in and that we come from, and aren't necessarily the knowledge-making frameworks that are always practiced in the dominant academy. And I don't want to unpack all of those things of what I might mean by the dominant academy, but following sort of the work of someone like Willie James Jennings, let's sort of just take, for instance, that much of the academy in the United States has at its in its critical formative years, has a deep and entrenched relationship with histories of colonialism and enslavement. And so there's a very much a discourse of mastery that often shapes the sort of dominant academy. Now, if we think about what Chisme is, it is actually specifically the discourse of those who are not the masters, right? And this is a really important thing to hold on to when I want to turn to think about what that might help us understand better about the Bible and about scriptures in a broader way, if we're thinking about the sort of ways of making knowledge that happens among those people who are not the ones holding power, but actually might be trading information about the people holding power and trading information among each other about the people holding power. In terms of biblical studies, this is considered relevant because while like if we think about the formation of the text we have, they're written texts. For most of human history, writing was a highly elite phenomenon. I mean, it still really is. So like to value writing, to value the written word is still a very sort of elite professional phenomenon, but it was much more so prior to the advent of the printing press. So when we think about the moment when most of the texts that we receive as the Bible come into formation, to write itself is an elite activity, but just because the biblical texts are being written by elites doesn't mean that we're talking about a community where writing is valorized in that kind of way, or that there are elites on the same order of the kind of elites we think of when we think of the modern day professoriate, right? Like we're talking about a different context. But one of the things that I think is important to bear in mind is that oral tradition had greater valence and power for most of the moments when the texts we get from the Bible were being written. They were being written in a context where the oral tradition was actually much more valued. And so determinations around writing and what went into writing was much more about fashioning texts that could be engaged with and traded around, but with the assumption that you always had a kind of accompanying oral tradition and practice. These texts were being read out loud. They were being performed. That was how most people were receiving them. So that's one of the important dynamics to think about. And so when I think about the formation of the texts that we have in the Bible, many of them contain stories that were first oral stories that were traded. And then even in being written down, they're kind of meant to be traded orally. They're meant to be exchanged in a more communal context. And then one of the other things that I like to point people to, and this came up in our last conversation on the podcast, and Dr. Dan kind of asked me to expand upon it a little. So I'm going to expand upon that, which is to say that, often in religious settings, there's this sort of insulting of people for being chismosa, or for being gossipy, or for trading the bochinche, like, you shouldn't do that. It's bad. Like, don't. And I think it's really actually interesting if we think about instead imagining that these biblical texts that are supposedly so foundational to Christian tradition only exist because of people engaging in chisme and gossip. And one of the people I love to pick on in this regard, because I think people tend to think of him in such a high, lauding way, is Paul. And basically, quite fundamentally, the letters of Paul only exist because of chisme. Like, and this is if you look throughout his letters and you start reading for chisme, it starts popping out at you in different ways. So first of all, like, one of the obvious examples is you look at 1 Corinthians 1:11. Paul's talking about the whole reason he's writing this letter to the Corinthians is because of stuff that's been reported to him by Chloe's people. I've heard that there are quarrels among you, and so, like, from Chloe's people, and so I'm writing to you. So, like, the whole basis of this is about chisme. It's, Chloe's people obviously matter. Paul is establishing himself as having a connection to the Corinthians through Chloe's people, who must also somehow have value within this sort of chisme knowledge circle. Paul will regularly talk about, like, I boast about you to other people when he's writing. So, like, this comes up in the second letter to the Corinthians in chapter 9, where he says, like, I want you to know that I go around talking about how great you are to other people. Like, this is part of what he was saying. I know your eagerness, which is the subject of my boasting about you to the people of Macedonia. This is something he talks about there. Another example is that he also trades on what he knows is gossip about himself. So in the letter to the Galatians, he talks about, you've heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. And something that you'll notice in all of these passages that I've given you is that, like, hearing, orality, like, I've heard from Chloe's people about you. I boast to other people, so I'm telling other people stories about you, or I know you've heard about me. So you're seeing that this sort of way, that this kind of back and forth, that is exactly this kind of chisme conversation. It's a really fundamental epistemological structure of the letters. It's a way that Paul establishes connection with the people to whom he's writing, and establishes the authority for sending them a written letter. I'm part of your little chisme circle. See, like, so please listen to what I have to say. Whether they actually listen to what he had to say, we have no idea. Because what happens is Paul's letters get enshrined in this written form that we treat as scriptural, and that we give authority to into a certain kind of way, because other people treated these letters with a certain kind of authority. But we don't know if the Corinthians or the Galatians actually bought Paul's chisme. They may not have. We have no idea, right? So, like, that's all there is to it. Now, I use that to talk about, like, it's one fun thing to think about how scriptures were formed by chisme. But I also think it's important to think about what chisme can help us do in thinking about scriptures in a broader way. And this is something I want to point to. I think it's important to think about what chisme is doing as a form of knowledge, and that it is a revelatory form of knowledge. And so there's a way in which we can think about how chisme can sometimes have power that rivals the scriptural. And here if we think about Jean-Pierre Ruiss's work about kind of the embeddedness of revelation in daily life, what chisme is fundamentally about is, it is about trading information and sort of sharing stories that give insight into things that might have been hidden. So sometimes they can be stories that are if you think about, again, that's why I'm saying this is not the discourse of the masters. When the masters are lying about who they are or what they're doing, and Chisme is that like story that says, you know, this person, he claims that he's all that, that he's this sort of like great guy who, you know, follows the rules or whatever, but really he's having an affair with so-and-so, or like really he took money and like stole it and hid it. Like this is a good way of like giving warning. One of the things that we talked about last time is, you know, something that came out in the middle of the sort of high point of the Me Too accusations against Harvey Weinstein is how many women warned other women about Weinstein, right? That this was an important way of providing information orally to try to warn people about what one of these dominating figures was doing and the way that they were abusing power. And so we can sort of understand Chisme as having this really valuable role of providing information and knowledge that's being purposely obscured and hidden by the powers that be. And one of the ways that you can think of it as therefore having a scriptural function is that scriptures are supposed to be that revelation of the knowledge that matters, right? And they are supposed to be what brings a community together. And so sometimes it might be that Chisme is serving a role of challenging the dominant norms of how people interpret scripture by helping us to see it differently, helping us to see its function differently. The final thing I want to open up is that I think Chisme tells us something really important about who has the power and the authority to make knowledge and on what terms. And so there's a kind of authorized level of knowledge, and where Chisme draws its power is in sort of helping us to see when things are wrong or false in that authorized and sort of dominant form of knowledge. But it requires the authority that's made in relationship. The authority for Chisme comes because of the relationships we have with each other. And in the sort of world of fake news, and we might point to that later, this is something that I think is valuable to help people think about, that I think a good critical Chisme studies would actually give us the tools to take apart fake news, because it would help us to think about who has the power to offer certain kinds of knowledge, what they get out of presenting certain kinds of knowledge, and whether we should trust them and why, and who we should trust and why. And so I think like a kind of critical Chisme studies, like grounded in this sort of history of thinking about, like I said, really, we've often overvalued the written word in a sort of formal authorized practice, but in the actual lived practice, we still very much value our kind of oral connections. And if we sort of retool and rethink the lessons we've learned from that, it might help us to undo some of the damage of this overly authorized written word that is social media these days. So that'll be my last word. I look forward to hearing what Dr. Moros has to say.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hidalgo and Dr. Dianda, for this invitation and for this opportunity to have a conversation again together, and the stimulation of hearing both of your angles in terms of research and my own research as a trained Christian social ethicist who's not working in that sort of focus field, but I went broader to go more toward gender, sexuality, and women's studies, but I apply what I learned to my teaching. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Chisme as a counter narrative, which is what I think we're all talking about. Counter narrative to mainline narratives or dominant narratives of whatever truth is being sold out there, whether it's fake news, whether it's the gospel of whatever the academy is, or the very gospel of our understanding in terms of scripture, right? Truth with a capital T, all the ways in which we call something truth. And in terms of my own training, my research ended up focusing on what happens when we live in a world that has hidden reality in terms of how history happened, how race making happened, the violence with which conquest, colonization, sexual violence that then made us into mestizos and mulattoes and all these categories of people, the violence with which we maintain social classes and social castes, etc. How does that happen? And what are the tools that people have in terms of mechanisms of resistance to that supposed truth, right? How is it that people maintain a sense of themselves, a sense of their history in the midst of so much brokenness and violence? And that is a natural segue to working with gender, sexuality, and women's studies, because we talk about these silences that are imposed, this erasure that happens, right? We don't get written into history. We're sort of submerged as other genders, other races, other classes of people that somehow don't exist, but for the official truth. So I see Chisme and I see my work more with regard to the scandal of silences and the scandal of truth making, because silences are never really silent. As you explained, right? Those who are forced to be silent end up warning each other. And I think that Chisme has multiple purposes in that way. My current work focuses on the method of testimonio, and I use this in my classes. Testimonio is something that I learned as a child when my parents were involved in human rights work in Latin America, which means it's your own story. You tell your own chisme. You're the one that lived political violence. You're the one that was tortured or imprisoned, etc. You're the one that experienced whatever genocidal violence. You're the only one that has the chisme, and you get to reveal it, whether it's for political purposes, for sort of social purposes, for changing laws, whatever it is. And using that with today's young people, I'm teaching undergraduates with regard to social violence out there, right? Whether it's gendered violence, sexuality, whether it's learning about racism, especially with my intro level classes where we learn about all kinds of structural violence. And especially after 2018, where people were involved in social protests, I started getting this feeling that a lot of people were able very easily to point out there, those people, right? The system, us, them kind of category, those people are at fault. The system is those people that have power. But we who are telling the chisme, we don't have power. And I wanted to change the roles a little and say, wait a minute, we're all part of the system. And we have power, even when it's telling the story and sharing the story. We have power when we are advocating for that. And we have to begin with ourselves and our stories, telling the scandalous chisme of, we too have privilege, not just we have been silenced, we have been erased, but what is it that gives us privilege in a system that says that we don't exist? And so I'm having my students work on this power of testimonio, reflecting on their own lives as we move through our classrooms. And I've learned that the power of chisme or testimonio, as I'm reclassifying it, is that it has this moral, ethical element, as Dr. Dianda was sharing, in which when we talk about social justice, all of a sudden we are now reinscribed in history because we are part of it, right? So these things happened to me as a child, or I experienced racism, or I experienced sexual violence. When I'm able to share that, right, voicing that, all of a sudden I'm no longer this silenced or erased piece, even if I'm just sharing it with one person. But it becomes sort of this awakening, right? And then it allows me to see that there are other forms of knowledge out there, that there are other forms that may not be the formal ways of creating knowledge, but that knowledge exists in the many ways in which we are all part of non-traditional cultures. So I teach a lot of undergraduates that are first generation, that are immigrants, that are racialized others, that come from very poor backgrounds. And so some of the things that I'm working with are students who, for example, are feeling shame because they're recognizing that their whiteness gives them privilege, but they themselves grew up poor, they grew up in a trailer park, they grew up with a very conservative religious background that ends up being abusive, and they recognize it as abusive now, that taught them a lot of things about gender, sexuality, social class, race, etc., that they now recognize in a very scandalous way as not having been truth. So this idea of other knowledge can also teach us about healing and living and even joy after having survived violence. So I see chisme as playing that role, because it's the chisme that you heard that then you convert into another form of chisme, right? The many ways in which chisme evolves. And also this idea of chisme as this coded message, right? Even when you are doing self-reflection and then sharing with another, the chisme was this, but in that chisme, there was something that was coded. And when I hear it now, I can recognize fake news, for example, right? And my own lived experience as a child, how chisme was used in a world where we didn't have internet. I'm that old. We didn't have the iPhones, right? We couldn't just text each other. I'm that old. We didn't even have landlines in the city where we lived. Very few landlines were afforded. So people would do something that we call in Venezuela, where I grew up, echar la bola a rodar, to get that ball rolling, right? So a story would begin here and it would move as a chisme, and people would all be informed that there would be some sort of political rally, or that there was going to be protests to go get your groceries because we're going to be under lockdown, or, right, it was a way of informing each other politically. So I saw it as a mechanism of political organizing and putting yourself in this story. And then that allows me then to see, in terms of, you were talking about dignity, or this idea of building and sustaining communities, in the 21st century, where we do have all these mechanisms of sharing information, there's so much information that still doesn't get shared. So when I teach, for example, my decolonial feminist classes, and we talk about solidarity, and we talk about sort of collaborative work, well, how does that happen when we don't even know what's happening across the world? We don't know their chismes. We're not involved in social action. We're so immersed in our own chismes here. In some ways, it happens through other ways of engaging in chisme, right? How is it that people who are maybe still part of communities that are depending on oral traditions, who may have cell phones, but really are not involved in our struggles here, and we're not involved in their struggles there, how do we connect? Right? And so my students have started talking about these mutual aid and local organizing, and how those local organizations are connected to local organizations elsewhere. So in a way, it's almost like relearning what those first communities of oral traditions were learning through chisme. That chisme does still have power beyond all the ways of communication that technology gives us access to. There's other ways of being empowered, whether it's through social organizing with political movements, workers' movements, women's movements. It's not about who gets to travel where, but someone who's organizing here heard from someone who's organizing there. So you don't technically have to travel. And it becomes like Paul's letters, right? I heard by somebody who went there that you all are organizing in this way. So I'm sending you information because I'd like to see if the way we're organizing in this way, right? Or we heard that you build this kind of strategy to get water. And now in our community, we no longer have water, even though we're in a first world nation. So we're going to try and use that mechanism. So learning from people who maybe don't have the same access to power, but have a different sense of power. So I'm seeing that chisme or testimonio then can allow us to see ourselves in the world from a different perspective. Maybe I thought I had no power, but I have a different kind of power. And I'll stop there, and maybe I went to sort of esoteric, but I see the ethics of what's happening in terms of how we understand knowledge, how we produce knowledge, and how we acquire knowledge, coming through this idea of chisme beyond the gossip, right? Chisme as a mechanism of power, chisme as a revelation of resistance methodologies that have not died out, and Chisme as this possibility for future ways of communicating beyond utopias, what's actually happening on the ground when people are organizing locally and get to know each other through some sort of Chisme. And so I'll stop there so we can engage in conversation. But I find that Chisme, as we've been taught as this bad thing where we gossip and we can hinder someone, Chisme as scandal can be more of exposing injustice, exposing a history that's been hidden, and exposing the true power that we each have because we're parts of communities that still value the oral tradition and value community in a different way. So I'm seeing it as a powerful tool rather than as this thing to be chastised, to not be used because it was this way that those gossipy women who already were lessened in power, or those gossipy old women very specifically, were sort of maligning people, right? Rather than sharing wisdom, sharing mechanisms of being in power in a different way, and sharing being in community in a different way, which I think we're now all in an age group in which we're now those viejas chismosas and we're sharing the chisme of the power of chisme. So, so here we are.
Thank you both, Dr. Moros and Dr. Hidalgo. I'm still getting comfortable with being of the age of las viejas chismosas. I still want to pretend I'm younger than I am, but that's not true. And many days I get very excited to claim that I'm not young anymore. So, but as you were talking, both of you mentioned chisme and power, but I really do think that Chisme is a form of social networking, of bringing people together, of building power groups or just groups, network groups with each other and being able to bring people together. And so I have two questions based on that, just on your thoughts. One is this form of social networking something you see continuing on, and should it be something that we keep sharing very publicly? So that's one, like, is outing Chisme as a form of power maybe outing too much about our own forms of power? And then the other one is about social media. And Dr. Hidalgo, you mentioned social media a little bit, but is social media and sharing on social media chisme, fake news? How would you classify it? What would you call it? And maybe what is it that studies of chisme and thinking about chisme could help us in how we navigate social media? And especially if you have professional tips on how to share professionally on social media, because I'm starting to see a whole lot of interesting shares that I think I'm not sure I would ever hire that person or want to ever work with that person. So just those are that's a whole loaded can, but feel free to take out any worm you wish.
You know, doesn't scripture say something about those who have eyes to see and those who have ears to hear? Like what we share publicly about chisme as power, I don't think everyone even understands unless they're part of communities for whom this is powerful. I hear an awful lot of conversations about narrative and storytelling, and I think each community understands that in its own terms. But when you talk about chisme and the power of those who have been deemed powerless, only those who've been deemed powerless understand. I think even scripture, I am of deep belief that it's full of encoded seeds and messages that, you know, for some it becomes this religious, rigorous thing, but they really don't get the point. It was written for a particular audience. It was told in a particular way. and only people who have experienced that get it. The liberative word of scripture is for those who need liberation and yearn for liberation. Those who are subjugating others do not get it. God loves them, but they didn't get the point. And even those who were being oppressed, think about the disciples, still didn't get it, still didn't get it. So it's not about romanticizing those who grew up with Chisme, but that there are coded messages, even in our conversation today, that I don't think it will be revealed, right? Much like the book of Revelations, half of us don't get nothing. Like, what? Things are shining and what? And they got lifted up where? What's going on here?
No one actually gets that book. Okay, just to be clear.
Exactly that, right? That
in someone else's chisme, you can't get it. So there are a couple of different things that I think about, and I think, I want to take the ways that we've created community and turn it against us in certain kinds of ways, and to use it to manipulate us. So then the third piece is going back to what I said, Chisme studies could actually help us undo that by helping us really think carefully about when is chisme good chisme, the way Dr. Moros was pointing to, when is it doing the work of undermining abusive violence? When is it doing the work of helping people in oppressed circumstances share revelatory wisdom and knowledge for survival, for undermining dictatorship or tyranny? And when is it doing the work of, when is it actually doing the work of reproducing the power dynamics as they are, of reproducing a sort of dominating order? I think that when we think about how chisme is functioning, when we know when something's good chisme and bad chisme in a variety of ways, I think really thinking that through can help us to think about what's fake news when we see it. My brother in Costa Rica, this is an example, Diego, he was talking about, there was this moment a few years ago where there was this WhatsApp message being passed around of supposedly of Nicaraguans burning the Costa Rican flag. And as soon as Diego saw it, he said, I know this is fake news. And the reason, I know it's fake news is I think about why would anyone be doing that? Why is this being circulated and sent around? And what does this actually look like to me? And it's sort of thinking about the power dynamics that's going on in the storytelling. And I think a good chismosa, she knows the power dynamics that shape the storytelling. And
it also points to that chisme just isn't a thing, it's a practice. Because you said a good chismosa, you have to be able to practice it and train and retrain in it, which is what something Dr. Motos you were pointing to. I wanted to pick up to the piece
building one narrative. I think that people who have been raised in the practice of chisme as a mechanism of community building have a built-in hermeneutic of suspicion, which I think is the problem with people who've been fed one narrative, one story, one idealized patriotic Christian religion, whatever. One narrative means that you have stopped suspecting that something is awry when you don't fit into that narrative. And that's problematic because you will not understand scripture. You will not understand when God is speaking to you. You will not stop when that bush is burning and talking to you because you're like, oh, the bush is burning, let me run away. But you won't see that your algorithm was being played with, that you were being fed false narratives, that you were being told to run away rather than to listen.
So I'm still going to run away from the burning bush. I'm sorry. Acknowledge together so that there isn't sort of one person who gets to demand things. And then to Dr. Moro's point, it also reminds us to have a hermeneutic of suspicion. We enjoy chisme, we enjoy engaging in it, but we're also always going to know that may or may not be true. There's a little bit of the this was a fun story. it may not all be true in a kind of like factual sense. The truth of it is different than that, right? Yeah.
It's also a mix, not just a
Yeah.
hermeneutic of suspicion, but something you taught me, Dr. Hidalgo, of a hermeneutic of generosity, being generous about who you're hearing the chisme happening, or even when we read our text and study our material, if we start hearing a narrative over and over, being generous about that. So sorry I cut you off.
No.
I just wanted to jump in and say that both of those are working simultaneously together.
And an element of grace. Because if I hear something about one person and it could be just so damaging, do I just jump in and repeat that? What's the purpose of that? That kind of chisme is what I'm not interested in. And I think it's just, very, that may be what people are complaining about.
It has no meaning to me, and it is not relevant. And I'm not interested in hearing that in a negative way, only in a fun way. Like and like there can be good stories about it. Oh, that person was with that person in a good way. I think it's very much about what are the stories about in relationship to what that person does and has done and says they're about, and the kinds of power that they.
What I'm nervous about in terms of how do we get people to really do introspection and to re-engage in community, right? Can you force people to do that? No. What kind of crises has to be present for that to happen, right? They're already in apocalyptic sort of thinking, right? The world is ended according to what I know. And I want to make it great again.
I think to your point, to try to bridge that back to Dr. Vanda's question about thinking about religion, I think that the study of Chisme teaches us a lot about trust and distrust, and what builds trust between people and what undermines trust between people. And so I think, your point about religious institutions and a lot of institutions right now being vulnerable to distrust, that would be nice.
So on that note of possibilities, we'll bring this to an end. Thank you both, because I know that part of what the Academy does for people from minoritized and underrepresented groups is to try to keep us separated, and part of that is keeping us very busy. So thank you for this 2 hours of time that you have given us, and the time that you spent preparing, and the time you will spend thinking about this in the future. And it's just such a gift to be with both of you. You've lifted my spirits. So I hope you're all well, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care.